clay is cold against your fingertips. In the climate-controlled vault beneath the British Museum, the temperature holds steady exactly 18 degrees Celsius because the museum has learned how fragile time can be when it's stored in earth. But the tablet in your hands carries a chill that has nothing to do with environmental controls. Catalog number K162. 7 columns of wedge-shaped marks pressed into Mesopotamian clay sometime around 1750 BCE. The curator's white gloves make the ancient artifact feel simultaneously delicate and impossibly heavy, like a thin object that weighs as much as what it claims to contain. And what it claims to contain is not a hymn, not a prayer, not a poem meant to soothe you into belief. It reads like instructions for how to die and come back, not metaphorically, not symbolically. A procedure, 7 gates, 7 removals, 3 days of transformation, a return that comes with conditions. The goddess Inanna descends to the underworld, is stripped of everything that makes her divine, dies, hangs as a corpse for exactly 3 days, and then rises again. But here is the detail that makes your hands tremble slightly as you turn the tablet to catch the light. The text does not present this as something that happened once far away to one deity. The language is procedural. The steps are ordered. In the ritual calendar, the cycle is reenacted annually, over and over. And suddenly, the question isn't, is this a story? The question becomes something stranger. What if you're not reading a myth at all? What if you're reading a manual for something that still happens? Because the Sumerians who created the world's first writing system around 3200 BCE in the region we now call southern Iraq left behind approximately 500,000 clay tablets. Most of them are not cosmic. They are mundane grain receipts, land surveys, tax records, ration lists, the bureaucratic machinery of civilization. And yet scattered among those administrative documents are texts that describe something the scribes recorded with the same meticulous precision they brought to inventory management. Not only the movement of barley, but the mechanics of existence itself, the architecture of life-death, and the return that follows. We call these texts mythology. We interpret them as creative expressions of ancient religious imagination, symbolic narratives that helped pre-scientific peoples make sense of natural phenomena they couldn't yet explain. But what if we've been reading them backwards? What if the Sumerians weren't inventing explanations? What if they were documenting observations? What if their myths are not stories, meant to fill ignorance, but the oldest surviving technical manuals for a cosmic system were still trapped inside? That's an uncomfortable question, because it demands something we don't like doing with ancient religion. It demands we consider, even briefly, that these texts might have been written with the intention of accuracy, not emotional truth, operational truth. And before you dismiss that as fantasy, before you decide the idea is too much notice, what else Sumerian texts contain in forms we tend to accept without flinching. They describe the orbit of celestial bodies with a precision that wouldn't be matched for millennia. They document surgical procedures that modern medicine has validated. They contain mathematical concepts like the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. We accept those as knowledge. We accept those as evidence that careful observation existed. So, Why do we assume that when the same scribal culture turns that same precision toward death and return, it suddenly becomes pure imagination? Why do we trust them when they speak about the heavens, but not when they speak about existence? Why do we respect their mathematics, but dismiss their metaphysics as poetry? Maybe the real question isn't whether the text is true. Maybe the real question is what the scribes believed they were doing. Were they entertaining, or were they recording? Were they comforting themselves, or were they trying to prepare you, prepare anyone who could read for what comes next? Because a manual has a different purpose than a myth. A myth can be flexible, a manual cannot. A myth can shift. A manual depends on sequence, and K162 is all sequence. 7 gates, 7 removals, 3 days, a return with conditions. You can feel the shape of the mechanism even before you fully understand it, the way you can feel gears in a machine you've never been trained to repair. And if this is a mechanism, if it is real, then your life right now is not a straight line. It is a point on a wheel. A point on a wheel that has been turning since before these words were pressed into wet clay. If you want a small marker, only if you want it leave where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Not because we need participation, because if the tablet's implication is even partly real, then this exact moment, wherever you are, is one point on something that keeps returning. And that brings us to where the Sumerians begin, when they widen the lens beyond one goddess. Not just the cycle of death and return, but the cycle of civilization itself. How many times has it risen? How many times has it collapsed? How many times has it been reset? And quietly, almost against our modern instincts, how many times have you already lived this life? They begin, as so many of their texts begin, with a phrase that sounds like history, but behaves like ritual. When kingship descended from heaven. Because if the cosmos is cyclical, then political authority is cyclical too, not invented, not developed, descended. And once you hear that word, the same discomfort returns. If kingship can descend, can it descend again? If it descended once, how many times has it already descended before? If Inanna's cycle repeats annually, what else repeats? So we go next to Oxford, to the prism that measures time the way we've forgotten how to measure it. Not forward into infinite progress, but around and around and around. In the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, Prism WB 444 sits in a carefully maintained display case. It measures roughly 8 inches tall. A squared column with 4 flat sides, each covered in tightly packed script wedge marks, so dense they feel like an argument against forgetting. This object, often called the Weld-Blundell prism, after its discoverer, contains what scholars call the Sumerian king list, a comprehensive chronicle of rulers who held power in ancient Mesopotamia from the beginning of kingship until roughly 1800 BCE. And it begins with a sentence that has disturbed historians for over a century, not because the words are difficult, but because of how casually they are presented. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not when humans first organized into kingdoms, not when leadership emerged from tribal structures, not when power developed gradually out of need. The kingship descended, as if government itself arrived fully formed, as if it was handed down from somewhere else, as if it was bestowed upon humanity rather than developed by it. And what follows that opening line is a list that seems to make no rational sense whatsoever, unless you read it as documentation of cycles rather than linear chronology. The first king is Alulim of Eridu, who ruled for 28,800 years. The second, Alalgar, held power for 36,000 years. The list continues. 8 cities and their rulers before something it calls the Flood. And these antediluvian monarchs held power for a combined total of 241,200 years. Another tablet variant, WB62, from Larsa, extends the scale even further, 10 pre-flood kings reigning for 456,000 years. Then the text states simply, "Then the flood swept over." No melodrama, no philosophical pause, just the statement of reset. And after this flood, the list continues. But now the reign lengths begin to decrease. The first post-flood King Gore of Kish rules for 1,200 years. Still impossible by our understanding of human lifespan, but dramatically shorter than his antediluvian predecessors. And as the list progresses through dynasties, the numbers continue to drop. They keep dropping. They keep collapsing towards something we recognize, until eventually you reach reigns that sit inside plausible human ranges: 5 years, 8 years, 23 years. Mainstream scholarship tends to explain these impossible reigns as mythological inflation, symbolic representations of a distant golden age, scribal error compounded over centuries, hyperbole, theological agenda. And on the surface, that interpretation seems reasonable until you notice something the dismissive explanation doesn't account for. The pattern isn't random. It isn't just exaggerated. It looks like a decline, a systematic decline, following something that feels almost like progression, like a curve, as if something that once allowed for extended existence gradually diminished over time. And the text offers no explanation for why early kings live for millennia while later kings live for decades. It doesn't argue. It doesn't justify. It doesn't explain itself. It simply records. Name, city, length of reign, next. That matters, because it implies a certain posture. The scribes aren't trying to persuade you. They aren't trying to convince an audience that these numbers are good storytelling. They copy the information like they would copy an inventory list, as if the legitimacy of the data does not depend on their ability to explain it, as if they are preserving something older than themselves, something whose significance they may not fully understand, but whose pattern they refuse to break. And the structure of the king list as a whole intensifies that feeling. It does not present a continuous narrative of progress from primitive beginnings to sophisticated civilization. It describes something closer to a wave. Kingship transfers from city to city after catastrophic destructions. Eridu falls. Kingship moves. That city falls. Power transfers again. Rise. Apex. Destruction. Transfer. Rise again. And then the great reset, the flood, after which the entire cycle begins anew, but with diminished parameters. This cyclical structure isn't isolated. It echoes through Sumerian creation narratives, through deity stories, through ritual texts. Time in this worldview is not a line, it is a wheel, but not only a wheel of seasons, a wheel of systems, nested cycles of different scales, daily cycles of light and darkness, monthly lunar cycles, annual seasonal cycles, longer political cycles as dynasties rise and fall, and larger reset cycles, catastrophic sweeps that do not end existence but restarted under altered conditions. And now the question returns rephrased, because this is how the texts behave. What if the pre-flood rains are not exaggerations, but data from a different iteration? What if the system itself used to operate differently? What if years here is not only a solar unit, but a way of counting cycles of existence? Iterations of order under parameters we no longer inhabit. The text gives a clue in its language about the flood. It does not say a flood happened. It says the flood swept over a passing force, a wave that covers and recedes. And after it sweeps over, kingship is in Kish, not established, not invented, in. As if kingship descends again the way it descended before. And another variant adds a detail that feels like mechanism rather than poetry. Kingship was taken up to heaven before the flood, then descended again afterward, a preservation mechanism. The essential pattern lifted, protected during reset, reintroduced afterward to begin again. And this same preservation logic appears elsewhere, in flood narratives where one man is warned and instructed to preserve life and knowledge. In epics where tablets written before the flood are sealed away, in the scribal obsession with copying, preserving, transmitting, because in a cyclical cosmos, the most valuable thing isn't dominance, it's continuity. The scribes weren't trying to make you believe, they were trying to make you remember. Remember that this has happened before. Remember that what seems permanent is temporary. Remember that the cycle continues, whether we acknowledge it or not. And the prism sitting behind glass measures time in a way we've forgotten how to read, not forward, around, which raises the question that begins to haunt everything that follows. If kingship descended once and descended again, then is the descending finished? Or does it happen again and again and again each time into a world with slightly different constraints? And if that is true for kingship, what is true for you? So we shift next from political cycles to the geography that underlies the deepest cycle of all. Not the rise and fall of cities, but the descent every individual makes. The place the Sumerians call Kur, the administered territory of death, the region with gates and rules and functionaries who do paperwork. Because the underworld in their texts is not a metaphor, it is a map. The Sumerian word for the underworld is Kur, a term that translates simultaneously as mountain and netherworld. A curious double meaning that reveals how the Mesopotamians conceive the realm where the dead reside. It is both beneath and beyond, both the deepest depth and the most distant height. A place at the edges of the known world, accessible through specific passages, but fundamentally apart from the geography of the living. Kur appears in countless Sumerian texts described with consistent geographic and architectural precision, not vague, not abstract. The tablets provide measurements, specifications, navigational details like someone mapping a place that exists even if it exists under different laws than the surface world. In several texts, the entrance to Kur is located in the east, where the sun rises. Or, from another perspective, where the sun enters the underworld to traverse it during the night. This isn't presented as metaphor, it's presented as root, and the doorway is guarded. A gatekeeper named Nedi controls access, enforces rules, asks identification questions, verifies authority, strips those entering of items they are not permitted to bring inside. Nedi does paperwork, and that bureaucratic detail matters. because it tells you something about the Sumerian imagination, if it's imagination. And it tells you something even more disturbing, if it's documentation. Kur isn't chaos. Kur isn't a formless void. Kur is administered territory. Records are kept. Names are recorded. Judgments are rendered. The dead continue to exist there, not as unconscious nothingness, but as entities who retain memory and identity, though in diminished form. They are described as eating dust and dwelling in darkness. Yet they remain aware enough to recognize visitors make requests, sometimes even return to the surface if protocols are broken. The journey to Kur involves 7 gates. This detail appears repeatedly across multiple texts with remarkable consistency. Not 6, not 8, 7. Each gate is a threshold, and at each threshold something must be surrendered. This structure is described most vividly in the Descent of Inanna, but it appears elsewhere too, in architecture, in ritual, in number, symbolism that repeats like a signature. 7 levels in ziggurats, 7 stations in ritual processions, 7 as completion totality, the full set. But notice the difference between symbolism and procedure. A symbol can be flexible, a procedure cannot. And when the text describes 7 gates, they describe them as functional, stages of a process that must be completed in sequence. For ordinary humans, Sumerian texts are blunt people who die go to Kur and remain there. There is no paradise, no heaven for the righteous, no clean ascension. The Giddim, the spirit, or ghost that persists, descends to the house of dust and resides there for what the texts imply is eternity. Funerary offerings are not meant to improve the afterlife into a different destination. They are meant to ensure the dead remain in Kur and do not return to trouble the living. Because returning is possible, not common, not encouraged, but possible. And the existence of rituals for preventing return tells you the geography works in both directions. The 7 gates can be traversed upward as well as downward. The gatekeepers usually prevent it, but usually implies exceptions, and exceptions reveal how the system works. One text from Nippur describes a dream in which a man encounters his deceased father at a gate. The father is trying to pass through, but cannot not, because passage is impossible, but because he lacks the required token or permission. Controlled access. Rules that govern movement. Not a poetic haze, but a regulated boundary. Kur is also described as having regions or districts, not a uniform plain of dust. Some dead reside in better conditions than others, depending on how they died and how their survivors maintain them. Warriors who died in battle, children who died young, women who died in childbirth. Different categories, different placement. The texts describe these divisions without explaining their purpose. But the implication is clear: death is not an endpoint. It is relocation into a structured domain where status and category still matter. And the most revealing detail comes from the administration itself. Ereshkigal rules Kur, yes. But she doesn't rule arbitrarily. She has scribes who keep records, judges who render determinations, gatekeepers who enforce protocols. And critically, she must negotiate with gods from the upper world when they want to retrieve someone, which means the system has rules that bind even its ruler. Kur isn't outside cosmic order, it's part of it. Underworld and upper world are components of a single system with multiple levels and interconnections. Death moves you from one part of the system to another, but it does not remove you from the system entirely. You remain within the structure, subject to its rules. Different location, different permissions, same cosmos. And if the cosmos is cyclical, if kingship descends repeatedly, if deities die and return annually, if catastrophic floods sweep over the world, only to have civilization rise again, then the question becomes difficult to avoid. Is human existence cyclical too? Not in the sense of seasons, in the sense of actual movement through Kur and back. The texts do not state this directly, but they build a world where return is not impossible, only regulated. A world where even divine beings cannot exit without substitution. A world where certain mechanisms, food of life, water of life, can reverse death under specific conditions. A world where the geography works both ways. The Sumerians lived between rivers, in a landscape where water tables rose and fell, where floods destroyed and receded, where boundaries between land and water were negotiable and shifting. They built cities on Tel's hills, created by layers of previous settlements, each destroyed and rebuilt atop ruins. To such a people, return would not feel strange. Everything in their experience demonstrated that what goes down can come back up, that what is destroyed can be rebuilt, that patterns repeat. So their geography of the afterlife reflects that understanding. Kur as the low point of a cycle, not necessarily terminal, a nadir from which ascent is structurally possible. They mapped the heavens, star catalogs, planetary charts. They mapped their cities, property surveys, and they mapped death with the same systematic attention, creating what feels like a schematic of afterlife structure. These aren't imaginative embellishments meant to entertain. They read like directions, information meant to prepare someone for a journey that in their system, every human eventually takes. And if the cycle is eternal, then it's a journey you've already taken before. Which brings us back to K162, to the descent that shows the gates most clearly. To Inanna, because if Kur is a map, Inanna's descent is a walkthrough, a step-by-step demonstration of the mechanism. And the detail that matters most is the one that keeps returning in multiple places 3 days. Not a while, not many days, 3 days and 3 nights. Counted, measured, as if timing is part of the machinery. Tablet K162 gives you the full weight of the descent, not as a legend you can keep at a safe distance, as a sequence you can follow. And the most striking thing about that sequence is how little it cares whether you like it. Inanna begins her descent with full divine authority. She carries what makes her not just clothing, but power made tangible. The text treats these objects as interface points, material expressions of immaterial capacity. At the first gate, Neti asks why she has come. Inanna gives her reason. She claims to be attending the funeral of Ereshkigal's husband, Gugalana, the Bull of Heaven. Whether that is true or pretext, the text does not pause to moralize. Protocol proceeds. Neti admits her with conditions. At the first gate, her crown is removed. At the second, her lapis necklace. At the third, her breastplate. At the fourth, her golden ring. At the fifth, her measuring rod and line. At the sixth, her dress. At the seventh, her robe. After each removal, Inanna asks what is happening. And Neti answers the same way each time. Be silent, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. The repetition isn't there to be poetic. It's there to be clear. This is how it works. This is what happens. Even to a goddess. By the seventh gate, Inanna is naked and powerless. Everything that made her divine has been stripped away. She enters Ereshkigal's throne room, diminished, reduced to bare existence, without attributes or protections. And then the judges of the Underworld 7 Anunnaki render their verdict. She is struck dead. The method isn't described as sword or poison. It's as if judgment itself is lethal, as if being seen by the system in the wrong state causes collapse. Her corpse is hung on a hook described with a term used for hanging meat. And that detail matters because it insists on physicality. Inanna doesn't dissolve into abstraction. She hangs there, body-present dead matter. And now the text counts. Not vaguely, not approximately. 3 days and 3 nights. 1 day, 1 night. 2 days, 2 nights. 3 days, 3 nights. Precision matters. Duration is part of the procedure. During these 3 days, action begins in the upper world. Inanna's minister Ninshubur was instructed, wait 3 days, and if she does not return, seek help. Enlil refuses, Nana refuses, but Enki responds. And Enki's response is not sentimental rescue, it is engineering. He creates 2 beings, neither male nor female, from the dirt beneath his fingernails. Creatures with no me of their own, meaning the Underworld's rules do not recognize them. They can enter without being subject to its laws. Enki gives them the food of life and water of life, substances that reverse death. And he instructs them with the kind of specificity that makes the story feel less like myth and more like protocol. They must empathize with Ereshkigal's pain, echo her suffering, win her favor, and then, when granted access to the corpse, sprinkle the food and water of life onto Inanna's body 53 times. Not 50, not 55. 53. A counted dosage, repeated application, as if resurrection is not a switch, but an accumulation. They do it, and Inanna rises. Death reverses, but she cannot simply leave. The law of the Underworld is presented as absolute. If you enter and exit, you must provide a substitute. Someone else must take your place. The system must remain balanced. Even Enki's workaround cannot bypass this. So, Inanna begins her ascent through the 7 gates. And now the process reverses. At each gate, what was removed is returned. Crown, necklace, breastplate, ring, measuring rod, dress, robe. She exits fully restored divine again. But not alone. Demons follow her, sent to ensure the substitute requirement is fulfilled. They accompany her through her cities, watching who she will designate. The choice must be hers. Finally, she reaches Uruk and finds Dumuzi, her husband sitting on a throne, apparently untroubled. She designates him. The demons seize him and drag him down to Kur, and the cycle continues beyond what most retellings include. Dumuzi's sister, Gesht Inanna, grieves. She offers to share his fate. A compromise is arranged. Dumuzi will spend half the year in Kur Gesht Inanna, the other half. Each takes turns. And the text presents this arrangement as permanent, eternal, not a one-time tragedy, a structure, a mechanism. And this is where the story stops being only about gods. Because it becomes a template, a demonstration of how the system works. 7 gates are not decorative. They are stages. The 3-day period is not symbolic. It is duration. The substitute requirement is not moral punishment. It is equilibrium in a closed system. And the seasonal cycle, Dumuzi's descent and return, becomes the visible surface effect of deeper machinery. The texts do not say the myth explains the seasons. They describe a cycle, and then the world reflects it. Cycle first, seasons second, mechanism first, nature as manifestation. And now the question returns again, because this is how the script must move. If this pattern applies only to deities, it is fascinating, but distant. If the 7 gates exist for everyone, if every human death involves passage through the same structure, then K162 is not a story about someone else. It is preparation. It is map reading. It is warning without panic. And there are hints in Sumerian practice that suggest they treated it that way. Grave goods, offerings, items placed with the body like payments for thresholds. Not explicitly stated as gate tolls, but aligned with the logic passage requires surrender. And later traditions describe the dead moving through stages, becoming progressively less bound to material identity. Which brings us to what remains after the stripping. Not the crown, not the robe, not the name. The core that persists. The thing Mesopotamian texts speak of in contracts and oaths, as if it is as real as breath, the giddim. The ghost, yes, but not ghost in the modern sense. Something structured, something that remembers, something that suffers, something that can return. And if a giddim persists, then the deepest question doesn't go away. It becomes sharper. If something persists, does it return? And if it returns, what happens to memory? Because the system strips. The system transforms. The system returns you, maybe. But what does it return? That is where we go next. If you strip a being down to nothing, down past crown and robe, down past necklace and breastplate, down past the visible signs that say, "This is who I am," then the question becomes painfully simple. What is left in the descent of Inanna? The removals happen at gates. They are enforced by protocol. They are repeated with the same phrasing until you understand you're not watching theft, you're watching procedure. The underworld takes what you brought. The underworld reduces you. And it reduces you not because it hates you, but because that is how passage works. So when we turn from gods to humans, we look for what human texts say survives that reduction. What remains when the body is gone, and the visible identity is gone, and the person has crossed into Kur. The word that keeps appearing is giddim. In old Babylonian letters, commercial correspondence, everyday documents dating to around 1900 BC, a formula appears that feels casual and therefore more disturbing. I swear by the Giddim of my father. Not by an idea, not by a metaphor, by a specific entity, a presence, a persistent remainder. The Sumerian word Giddim and its Akkadian counterpart Atemu is usually translated as ghost or spirit, but those English words carry the wrong atmosphere. They suggest superstition. They suggest fiction. The Mesopotamian documents don't use the term like that. They use it like a natural category, like breath, like shadow, like the part of a person that continues when the body stops. Every person has a giddim. When the body dies, the Giddim continues. Not as theological speculation, as an assumption embedded in how people swear oaths, how they write contracts, how they warn each other, how they explain misfortune. And the texts give you clues about what a Giddim is by describing what it does. A Giddim retains personality and memory. The dead recognize family members in dreams. They appear with grievances. They recall unfinished business. This is not a blank residue. It is continuity, and a Giddim can suffer. Funerary offerings in Mesopotamia are not sentimental gestures. They are provisions. The dead in Kur eat dust and drink brackish water unless the living provide better. Tablets describe the Giddim hungry, cold, neglected. Not metaphorically starving. Starving in the only way a Giddim can starve, through lack of ritual feeding, lack of offerings, lack of care. A Giddim can also act in the world of the living. If the body was not buried correctly, if obligations were neglected, if the person died violently or prematurely, then the Giddim can return and cause problems. Illness, disturbances, a haunting not as horror story but as administrative failure, a spirit out of place, an account unsettled, a debt unpaid. And because a Giddim can return texts include rituals for sending it back, for pacifying it, for ensuring it remains where it belongs. That language belongs matters, because it implies the system has a correct flow. Life to death, death to Kur, Kur to whatever comes next. And deviations from that flow create consequences. Most striking of all, a Giddim can be summoned. Necromantic practices in Mesopotamia were not framed as fantasy. They were framed as dangerous technique. A ritual specialist could, under controlled conditions, bring a Giddim back temporarily to answer questions, to provide information. The texts acknowledge this as possible while warning against it, except under grave necessity. So now we have a system with several components. A structured underworld with gates and officials. A death process that strips away attributes. A remainder, the Giddim, that retains identity and memory. The possibility of return, though regulated. The possibility of summoning, though risky. And the question that has been circling since we touched the cold clay becomes harder to avoid. If the Giddim persists, is Kur a final residence or a holding space? Because the texts sometimes speak as if Kur is forever, and sometimes they speak as if movement is possible. And those two statements don't cancel each other, they create tension. The kind of tension a culture preserves when it is documenting a system it can observe at the edges but cannot fully see. And the moment you introduce cycles, the kingless descents and resets, Inanna's yearly reenactment, Dumuzi's half-year exchange, that tension becomes a question about repetition. If existence is cyclical, if descent is followed by ascent, if return is not a one-time miracle but a structural possibility, then what happens to the Giddim across cycles? Does it return? And if it returns, what returns? Because memory is one of the most fragile things we know. The underworld strips, the underworld judges, the underworld transforms, and we're told repeatedly that what you bring cannot remain intact. Inanna loses her regalia at each gate. Yet when she rises, she remembers enough to be furious. She knows who she is. She recognizes her husband. She chooses her substitute. So memory, at least for her, seems to persist through death and restoration. But she is a goddess. and the rules might not match human rules. So we look sideways to another ritual one that reveals how Mesopotamians thought the cosmos could be negotiated without being overpowered. The substitute king ritual. In Neo-Assyrian texts from the first millennium BCE ritual procedures, preserved with bureaucratic clarity, there is a practice that exists for one reason: omens. If signs predicted the death of the king, priests could install a substitute. A commoner placed on the throne, dressed in royal regalia, treated as the king. Meanwhile, the real king adopted a different identity, symbolically becoming someone else. Then, when the ominous period ended, the substitute was killed. The death required by the omen was fulfilled, but by the wrong person. And the real king resumed his identity and continued ruling. This ritual only makes sense if the system can be satisfied by designation. If king is not merely a body, but a role, a title, a pattern that can be attached. And if the cosmos responds to that attachment, if the omen's demand can be redirected by shifting identity markers, then identity is not as fixed as we want it to be. It becomes, at least in part, a function of assignment, a label the system recognizes. So now the question reappears, changed slightly. If the cosmos can be tricked by substitution, at the level of kingship, if a death can be paid by a stand-in, then what does that imply about the underworld substitute requirement? When Inanna exits, someone else must enter. Balance must be maintained. Perhaps the system doesn't care who, only that the exchange occurs. Perhaps it tracks categories, roles, designated substitutes. Perhaps it is mechanical in a way that looks cold from the human side. And if that's true, then the Gidim's continuity becomes even more complex. Because the Gidim may persist, but the identity it wears in life may not. The body dies. The Gidim continues. And when return happens, if return happens, the returning essence may enter a new form, under a new name, a new set of social markers, a new life that feels like the first. Because the previous identity has been stripped away like regalia at gates. Which leads to the hardest question yet. If return is real, why don't we remember? Is forgetting an accident? Or is forgetting part of the mechanism? Is memory one of the garments removed at a gate we cannot see? Or is memory retained somewhere else, held in the Gidim, inaccessible to waking consciousness, leaking only in dreams, in strange recognitions, in moments we can't explain? The texts don't answer. They circle. They preserve the system in fragments, oaths sworn by Gidim rituals for restless dead, procedures for substitution maps of Kur, with gates and officials. And the more you place these fragments beside each other, the more the same feeling returns. This isn't a culture telling fairy tales. It's a culture living inside an administrative universe. A universe where rules exist, where passage is regulated, where debts persist, where balance must be maintained, and where something of the person something continues. So we return again one more time to the core question because it refuses to settle. What does it mean if the Gidim persists? Does persistence imply return? Or does persistence only mean endurance in dust? And if return is possible, is it rare, reserved for gods and ritual exceptions? Or is it normal, but hidden behind the gates, erased by the stripping, made invisible by forgetting? We move next to the figure who makes the cycle visible on the surface of the world. not a king, not a ghost, a shepherd, a dying god whose return is calendrical, measured, expected, repeated. Because if you want to understand whether return is structure or accident, you look for where the texts treat return as schedule, and that is Dumuzi. There are stories that end, and there are stories that don't end because they aren't shaped like stories. They're shaped like schedules. They're shaped like calendars. They're shaped like something that keeps happening whether you remember the last time it happened or not. In Mesopotamia, Dumuzi is that shape. Not simply a character, not simply a mythic lover, a mechanism that comes back on time, a death that is not a single past event, but an annual present, a return that is not a metaphor for hope, but a fixed point in the year. And when you read the tablets, when you read them, the way the scribes wrote them, the disturbing part isn't the grief. The disturbing part is the certainty, because the laments don't speak as though they are describing a distant legend. They speak as though they are describing something that is occurring again, now, this season, this year. British Museum Tablet, SP2464. Sometimes catalogued under 34945, preserves a strange hybrid, part lament, part instruction, a text that doesn't just mourn Dumuzi, but tells you how mourning is done, when it is done, what offerings are required, what words are spoken, what preparations are made, not simply for his death, for his return. Not remember that he returned once, but prepare because the return is coming, and that is the first hinge. Because a culture can tell a sad story and cry over it, but a culture that builds a yearly ritual program around a death and return cycle is doing something else. It is marking time by a mechanism. It is treating myth as calendar. And once you have calendar, you have something closer to procedure. You have an expectation that if you do the right things at the right time, you align with what is happening underneath the visible world. Dumuzi appears in many guises: shepherd, king, consort of Inanna, a figure pursued, a figure dragged, a figure mourned. But beneath the shifting images, the same architecture remains. He goes down, he stays down, he comes back. And he does not do this once. He does it again and again. Forever. That forever matters. Because so many myths are built to resolve. A hero triumphs, a monster dies, a curse is lifted, a world is created and then stabilizes. But Dumuzi's narrative is one of repetition without resolution. There is no final victory. There is no permanent escape. There is only the compromise. The exchange. Half a year and half a year. A cycle that does not conclude because it is not aiming toward conclusion. It is describing a structure that keeps the world functioning. And the story that leads to it is not gentle. In the wake of Inanna's return from Kur, the Underworld does what the Underworld always does. It enforces balance. You exit, you replace. A substitute must be named. And the demons, those functionaries of the Underworld's law, follow Inanna, not as random horror creatures, as enforcement, as procedure made violent. The text is clear about this. They cannot simply seize anyone. They require her designation, her choice. The substitute must be assigned. And Inanna moves through the world above with the demons behind her, looking for the one who will pay for her return. This is not romance. It is administration. And the tablets linger on the cruelty of what makes Dumuzi the chosen one. not because he is wicked, not because he is monstrous, but because he is not mourning, because he is seated on a throne, because life in Uruk continues, because her absence did not break him the way the underworld broke her. In fury, she points, and that pointing is enough. The demons see him and drag him down. Dumuzi runs, he hides, he transforms. In some texts, he becomes a gazelle, trying to slip out of sight the way prey slips through reeds. He begs for help. His sister Inanna refuses to betray him. The texts emphasize her refusal again and again, because refusal is one of the deepest themes running through this entire system. Not a heroic refusal, a helpless refusal. The refusal of someone who has no power except the power to not comply. And even that power breaks under pressure. Dumuzi is found, seized, dragged down, and the descent is described in language that echoes the descent of Inanna. Gates, thresholds, progressive loss, vitality stripped in stages. And by the time he reaches Kur, he is not a proud god on a journey of conquest. He is reduced. He is a body. He is meat. The underworld takes him the way the underworld takes everything. And then, this is where the structure reveals itself. The story refuses to end. Because Inanna's grief does something the tablets treat as consequential. She does not simply mourn. She does not simply accept. She persists. She laments without ceasing. And eventually the divine assembly, whether by pity or pragmatism or necessity, arranges a compromise. Half-year exchange. One sibling below, one above. Then switch. So the underworld keeps its substitute. The upper world keeps life. The balance holds. But it holds only because it moves. Only because the system cycles. And this is where the surface world becomes the evidence. Because the texts connect Dumuzi's location to the condition of the land. When Dumuzi is in Kur, the land suffers. Heat intensifies. Vegetation withers. Water becomes scarce. The Mesopotamian summer, brutal dry life retreating into whatever shade and dampness remains. When Dumuzi returns, the land revives. Rains come. Temperatures ease. Plants grow. The agricultural year begins again. And here the interpretive temptation arrives. It's the one modern readers always reach for. We say, this is just a seasonal myth. A poetic explanation for why crops die and return. And yes, there is correlation. The texts make it explicit. But the texts do something subtle. They reverse causality. They do not say, because the seasons change, Dumuzi dies. They say, because Dumuzi dies, the seasons change. The cycle is primary. The weather is effect. The visible world is surface expression of a deeper mechanism. And if that is the structure, then Dumuzi becomes more than agricultural symbolism. He becomes a demonstration that death is not an endpoint, a demonstration that Kur is not only a terminus, but a station in a loop. Because Dumuzi comes back, and he comes back on time, not just whenever people feel like celebrating harvest, but according to calendars maintained with the same rigor Mesopotamian priests used for stars. This matters, Because the same scribal tradition that tracked Venus and predicted eclipses also tracked ritual time. It measured, it counted, it aligned. And when laments for Dumuzi specify dates, stations, offerings, sequences, what you are seeing is not just emotional expression. You are seeing administration of a cycle. And the people participating in these laments, the grief was not casual. It was not theatrical in the way we might assume. Women gathered and wept for Dumuzi as if for a dead family member. Not because they were pretending, because the death was treated as present. And then the mourning shifted to celebration at the moment of return. Again, not because they were completing a dramatic script, but because the calendar told them the mechanism had turned. Return had occurred. Life resumed. The switch happened. And in this, Dumuzi becomes a visible analog for a question we have been circling since the moment you felt the cold clay. If a god can cycle, if a god can descend, remain, and return, if the system requires substitution and balance, then what stops the same architecture from applying to everyone? The usual answer is humans do not return. Humans go to Kur and stay. But the Giddim complicates that. The summoning complicates that. The restless dead complicate that. The fact that Kur has gates that can be traversed upward under some conditions complicates that. And Dumuzi above all complicates that, because he shows that the underworld is not sealed, it is regulated, which means there are rules. And where there are rules, there are procedures. And where there are procedures, there are exceptions, not miracles. Exceptions, technicalities, workarounds. The same kind of loophole Enki used when he spoke to a wall. The same kind of substitution trick the priests used when they placed a commoner on a throne and let him die for the king. So the question returns, changed again heavier. What if Dumuzi's cycle is not metaphor for plants? What if plants are metaphor for the cycle? What if the visible dying and returning of vegetation is the surface shadow of a deeper movement? Essence, descending essence, returning, played out across scales. And what if the reason the laments feel personal is not because the people are acting out farm anxiety? What if it feels personal because it touches their own fate? Because Dumuzi is not only the shepherd who dies, he is the shepherd who returns. And in a cosmos that teaches through repetition, the one who returns becomes a promise. Not a promise spoken like comfort, a promise demonstrated like mechanics. And this is why the cycle is unsettling, because it offers no final escape. Dumuzi does not break free. He does not defeat the underworld. He does not abolish the substitute requirement. He just rotates. And if that is the model, then what it suggests about existence is not salvation. It is recurrence, which means the comforting part is not that the cycle ends. The comforting part is that return exists at all. And the horrifying part is that return might be unavoidable. So we come back again to the core question the tablets refuse to stop asking in different forms. If return is built into the system, who returns? Does the Giddim return? Does it return with memory? Does it return stripped? And if it returns stripped, is the returned you still you? Or is it only the continuity of essence, the thread without the story, the core without the name? To answer that, the texts keep pulling us back to numbers, to fixed durations, to measured thresholds. Which is why the next step is the one that appears everywhere like a pulse. Not 7 this time. 3. 3 days. 3 nights. the counted interval where transformation happens. Because if return is real, it has timing. And the timing is never casual, it is always measured. If the shepherd's cycle is a clock you can hear, then the 3 days are the click you feel but can't locate. Because the number doesn't appear once. It appears everywhere, quietly, repeatedly, counted the way you count grain, counted the way you count debts, counted the way you count the sky. 3 days, 3 nights, not a while, not a symbolic span, 3 rotations, 72 hours of something. And the most unsettling thing about the tablets is not that they mention 3, it's that they measure it. They don't gesture. They don't drift. They count. In Inanna's descent, the count is explicit. Her corpse is hung on the hook. And the text does not allow you to look away by making the time vague. It gives you the rhythm. 1 day, 1 night, 2, 3. As if the duration is not decoration, but requirement. As if the period is not poetic emphasis, but a stage in a procedure that must be allowed to complete. And then only then does the sequence of intervention begin. Not immediately, not as soon as she dies. Only after the counted threshold. Only when the calendar's smallest teeth have clicked into place. And that raises the question we keep returning to, because the tablets keep returning to it. Why does time matter so much in these texts? Why are the durations treated like law? Why do they read less like songs and more like protocols? The usual answer. Our comfortable answer is that 3 is symbolic, completion, totality, a tidy number for minds that like tidy shapes. And yes, the symbolism is there. The Sumerians used 7 for completeness and 3 for closure, and the numbers carry cultural weight. But the problem is that the texts don't behave like symbolism. They behave like scheduling. They behave like someone describing a system that has timing built into its mechanics. The corpse hangs for 3 days and 3 nights. And then the minister Ninshuber acts. Not because she suddenly feels brave, because she was instructed to wait, because waiting is part of the plan, because the system has windows. And windows imply rules about when something can still be altered and when it can't. This is where the descent narrative becomes less like mythology and more like a diagram. Because in that 3-day period, something is happening. The text does not give us a laboratory report. It does not tell us the chemistry, but it shows us the structure. A boundary has been crossed. A state has begun. And a state must be allowed to stabilize before reversal is possible. Enki's solution is not a warm prayer. It is engineering. He creates 2 beings who don't fit the categories that Kerr recognizes. Neither male nor female. Neither alive in the normal way nor divine in the normal way. Beings with no me of their own meaning in the logic of the text. The underworld's bureaucratic gaze cannot properly read them. They slip past what is designed to stop everyone else. And then Enki does not give them a single act of resurrection. He gives them substances, food of life, water of life, things applied like treatment, and he gives them instructions that are astonishingly specific. Not bring her back, not rescue her, but empathize with Ereshkigal, mirror her pain, gain her favor, request the corpse, apply the substances, and apply them again, counted exact 53 times, not 40, not a sacred rounded number, 53, a number that reads like something discovered the hard way, a number that reads like this is how many it took. And you can feel the implication pressing through the clay like the impression of a stylus. If resurrection is possible, it is not a switch. It is not a single divine word. It is accumulation, dosage, repetition, threshold. And when you combine that with the 3 days, the shape becomes clearer. The 3 days are not the resurrection. They are the phase that makes resurrection possible, or the phase that makes it meaningful, or the phase that makes it legal in the Underworld's accounting. The text does not explain which, but it insists on the count. It insists on the timing. So the question returns, turned again like the same object in new light. Is the 3-day period symbolic because humans chose it? Or is it symbolic because it describes something real that kept reappearing? And if you follow the number across the corpus, it keeps reappearing. In Gilgamesh, the test of wakefulness is 6 days and 7 nights. And Gilgamesh fails. He falls asleep. He is unconscious for a counted span, not vague, measured, as if sleep itself is a cousin of death, another descent, another removal from ordinary awareness tracked in the same administrative tone. 6 days, double 3, a longer threshold, a heavier demonstration of a boundary he cannot cross. And in the flood narratives, the storm lasts 7 days and 7 nights. But inside that 7, the tradition keeps finding 3s. Phases, markers, intensity rising, peak destruction, then the shift toward receding. Nested cycles, a larger wheel made of smaller wheels. And again, you feel that the point isn't merely that 7 is sacred. The point is that catastrophe is treated like procedure. Time has shape. Time has stages. Time has counted thresholds that determine what can happen next. Even the substitute king ritual, the one the priests used when omens predicted death, moves like this. A period is declared, a substitute is installed, a dangerous time is measured. And inside that measured time, 3-day markers appear like nails hammered into a plank so you know where you are while crossing it. The cosmos in that ritual logic is not persuaded by emotion. It is satisfied by alignment, by timing, by the death happening in the correct window, attached to the correct role. The wrong person can die as long as the schedule is obeyed. And that is where the whole framework becomes unsettling, because it suggests something impersonal, something mechanical, something that does not judge like a mind judges, but processes like a system processes. And if that is true at the level of omens and substitutions, if timing and designation can redirect consequences there, then the 3-day threshold in death narratives begins to look less like poetry and more like a rule about when the state becomes fixed, a rule about when reversal becomes impossible without extraordinary intervention. The texts themselves hint at this in practice. They describe families maintaining intensity, offerings, presence, fire attention in an initial period after death, and then easing, as if there is an early phase when the dead are not fully settled, as if the Giddim is in motion, hovering between, not yet fully resident in Kur. And that phase is often treated as 3 days. Again, not because the family likes the number, because the number has gravity in the system. 3 days as a window of permeability, a window where what happens next might still be influenced. If you miss the window, the door closes. The Giddim descends fully. The Underworld's category becomes stable. And then the long wait begins. So we come back again to the feeling the tablets create without ever saying it directly. Death is not a single moment. It is a process. And processes have durations. And the Sumerians who measured and counted everything else measured and counted this too, which is why the 3 days matter more than symbolism can comfortably explain. Because symbolism does not require precision. Symbolism does not require 53 applications. Symbolism does not require the same hard counting voice used for inventories and reign lengths. Symbolism can use numbers, yes. But here the numbers feel like joints in a machine. 7 gates, 3 days, 53 touches of life, a substitute required, balance enforced. And the question returns because it always returns more quietly. Now, if the system has thresholds, then what happens when you cross them? What is stripped first? What remains last? What survives the descent and what cannot? Is memory one of the things removed at the gates? Is identity one of the things surrendered? And if you return, if return is real, do you return as yourself or as a thread without the story? The tablets do not answer. They do what they always do. They give you the pattern. They give you the measured stages. They give you the counted time. And then they move on to the next loop, the larger loop, where the same architecture appears at civilizational scale. Before the flood, after the flood. A great sweeping over, a reset, a redescent of kingship. A world that comes back diminished. A world that comes back altered. A world that comes back anyway. Because in these texts, nothing is simply erased. It is stripped. It is reduced. It is transferred. It is restarted, which is why the flood narratives matter here not as separate myths, but as another expression of the same mechanics. And that is where we go next. Because the 3 days in darkness are a miniature, and the flood is the same structure written large across the land. The tablets keep insisting on one gesture, a sweep, a covering over, a force that moves across everything, not to erase existence, but to interrupt it, to reset it, to press a boundary into the record. And the language they use is strangely consistent. Not a flood happened, not water rose, but the flood swept over, like a tide across a surface, like a wave that passes. And if it passes, that means something remains underneath, changed, buried, reduced, but not turned into nothing. Which is why the flood is never only a disaster in these texts. It is also a mechanism, a reset that has a structure, a beginning, a middle, a counted duration, an end, and then a continuation that is not a continuation. Because what follows is not the same world. It is the world after. And the texts circle this point again and again as if they are trying to make sure you don't miss it. There was a before. There was an after. And something happened that made the two not identical. The Sumerian tradition names 5 cities before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurapak. The list is not poetic. It is administrative, names on a ledger. And that tone matters, because the scribes don't treat the pre-flood world like a dreamland. They treat it like an earlier entry in the same book, a section that has been damaged, a section whose numbers are strange, but a section they copy anyway with the same formula they use for kings they can verify. Name, city, duration, transition, and then the line that cuts the page. Then the flood swept over. And then the phrase that comes back like a stamp after the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven. Kingship descends again. Not discovered, not invented anew, not painfully reconstructed from scratch. Descended, as if it's an object or a function held somewhere else until needed, as if it can be withdrawn and reissued, as if it is not a human achievement, but a cosmic instrument. And whether you read that literally or not, the structure is unavoidable before kingship exists. Flood interruption. After kingship exists again, but in a different place. Eridu before, Kish after, same institution, new seat. And that is the core rhythm. Not one city, not one dynasty. A pattern of transfer, a pattern of restart, a pattern of governance treated like something that can be moved through catastrophe. The Eridu Genesis fragmentary partial broken preserves the warning. Enki warns Ziusudra, not in a dramatic speech, not in a battle, in a technical workaround. He speaks to a wall. He keeps the letter of an oath while violating its spirit. And that detail is not decoration. It is a principle. It says even when the system binds its agents, loopholes exist. Even when authority is unified in decree, it is not unified in practice. Even when the outcome is total is still compromised by procedure. And the flood itself again has counted time. 7 days, 7 nights. The storm is not timeless chaos. It is scheduled violence. It begins. It lasts. It ends. The waters recede. A sacrifice is offered. And the gods, shaken hungry, afraid, gather, like flies. That recurring line, again. Not because it's flattering, because it's revealing, because it shows dependency. It shows that the gods aren't merely sovereigns who can exterminate with no cost. They need what humans provide. Labor, offerings, maintenance. The flood threatens the economy that made the human project useful in the first place. So the system cannot simply annihilate and walk away. It must rebuild. It must reissue kingship. It must reestablish order. Which is why the flood is presented as a reset, not as finality. And Atrahasis gives the clearest frame for this. In Atrahasis, the flood is not moral judgment. Not you were wicked, not you deserved it. The problem is administrative. Noise, population, disruption. The solution begins with calibrated measures, plague, drought, famine, and only after those fail does the flood appear as the final tool. A last resort in an escalating protocol. And even then, the text is careful. The gods are bound by oath. Secrecy enforced. A plan coordinated. But Enki still finds the crack that allows survival to slip through. Again, not rebellion by force, resistance by knowledge. And then the post-flood world is redesigned. Humans are recreated but with constraints, shorter lifespans, infant mortality, women who cannot bear children, mechanisms that prevent the population from ever again reaching the level that triggers a flood. And notice how that mirrors what we've been following. In the king list, reign lengths diminish. In atrahasis, lifespans are curtailed. In the sages tradition, the post-flood sages become partially human, no longer purely divine. Everything after the flood is smaller, reduced, limited, more constrained. Not because the world is worse in a moral sense, but because the system has adjusted its parameters after a crisis. And that's the loop the texts won't stop drawing. A crisis occurs. A reset follows. The world resumes under new constraints, and the pattern continues. Which brings us back again to the uncomfortable question these texts keep offering and refusing to answer. Is the flood a one-time memory, or is it a template? Because the narratives behave like templates. They repeat. They echo each other. They preserve consistent structures across different languages, different centuries, different cities. They insist that civilization existed before, was swept away, and returned. And the king list goes further. It implies that kingship itself is an element that can be withdrawn and redeployed, taken up, descended again. And if something can descend more than once, then we are forced to ask slowly without rushing. How many times has it already descended? Because the king list begins with after kingship descended from heaven. But it doesn't say for the first time ever. It doesn't narrate the first descent as a unique origin. It simply states it as a condition already true, which is exactly how the descent of Inanna begins. She descends. The gates already exist. The rules are already established. The Underworld's law is already binding. She is not creating the system. She is entering it. And the flood narratives feel similar. The flood sweeps over. But the capacity for reset seems already present. The mechanism exists. It is invoked, and then it releases. So the more we read, the more the structure becomes the message. Not the moral, not the hero, the structure. Life as cycles, civilization as cycles, kingly authority as cycles, death as cycles, descent, duration, return, with modification, with loss, with diminished parameters. And this is where the question grows heavier, because if this pattern is not merely literary, if it is not merely imaginative, then it implies that catastrophe is not an exception. It is a feature, not accidental, not random, built into the architecture of the system. The Sumerians dated years by disasters. The year the city was destroyed, the year the waters came. They lived as if catastrophe was part of the calendar, and perhaps in their view, it was. Which brings us back again to the same tension. We can treat these narratives as myth-symbolic explanations of floods, of dynastic shifts, of social collapse. Or we can treat them as documentation records of patterns observed, repeated, and preserved because they mattered for survival. And if we take the second possibility seriously, even for a moment, then the flood is no longer merely ancient. It becomes a warning about how systems behave, about how growth triggers constraint, about how administrators respond when ordinary controls fail, about how total solutions still leak, about how what survives becomes the seed of the next world. But survival comes with a cost, and the cost is reduction, diminished life, diminished reigns, diminished sages, diminished memory. And that loops us forward into the final assembly of the evidence. Because if the flood is a reset, and if death is a reset, and if kingship descends repeatedly, then the pattern is not merely in one corner of the literature. It is everywhere. The king list, the descent texts, the Giddim records, the substitute king ritual, the Dumuzi laments, the astronomical schedules, all of them describing in different registers the same mechanism: descent, duration, return, and repetition. So the question is no longer only did a flood happen, it becomes what kind of world produces stories that read like operating manuals for catastrophe. And more quietly, if they were preserving a template, what were they preparing for? That is where we go next. Because once you accept that the flood functions like a model, you start seeing the same model in everything else. And then the question becomes unavoidable, not dramatic, not sensational, but steady. What happens when you arrange all the pieces side by side? If you take the tablets one at a time, you can keep them in their museums. You can keep them in their categories: myth, ritual, chronicle, lament, omen. You can file them neatly. You can say, this is literature, this is religion, this is politics, this is superstition. And if you keep them separated, the discomfort stays manageable. Because each text on its own can be explained away. A story about a goddess in the underworld, a king list inflated with legendary numbers, a flood memory exaggerated into cosmic drama, a lament for a shepherd god as a seasonal metaphor, a ghost concept as psychological consolation. Taken individually, you can say, humans tell stories, humans invent meaning, humans search for patterns. But the problem is that these tablets do not behave like isolated inventions. They behave like pieces of a single architecture, like sections of the same blueprint preserved in different rooms. And the moment you put them beside each other, something begins to show itself, not as a single new claim, not as a sudden revelation, but as repetition, a structure that keeps returning, a shape that appears again and again, scaled up and down, expressed through different genres, but retaining the same bones. Descent, duration, return, and repetition. You see it in the daily sky. The sun goes down. It enters the realm beneath. It crosses the night. It returns. The Sumerians didn't treat sunset as the end of the day. They treated it as the beginning of the underworld shift. The sun travels, the sun enters, the sun returns. And this isn't poetry to them the way it is to us. It's a schedule, a mechanism that repeats with enough reliability to build calendars, agriculture, and governance around it. Then you see it in the month. The moon grows. It reaches fullness. It diminishes. And then this detail matters. It vanishes. A dark period, a disappearance. Not permanently, not as death with no return, but as absence that is followed by reappearance. The moon is gone, and then it is back. And again, the timing is stable enough to build ritual cycles on it. To assign meaning, yes. But first to assign predictability. And then you see it in the year. The land dies in summer. The green retreats. The heat dominates. And then life returns. Not randomly, not whenever it feels like it, but in a sequence that repeats. And Dumuzi becomes the name of the mechanism. He descends, he resides, he returns. 6 months, 6 months, a trade, a substitute, a balance kept, and the rituals are built around that balance. Not because people love sadness, because people are trying to participate correctly in a system they believe is real. The lament is not only emotion, it is also alignment. The community mourns because the cycle is happening now, not once, long ago now. And then when the return comes, the community shifts. Because the mechanism has turned. The descent phase is over. The ascent phase begins. And the text's tone, again, doesn't emphasize personal sentiment. It emphasizes scheduling. It emphasizes a structure that will keep repeating. Now scale up again. Cities rise, they grow, they accumulate power. They build walls, they dig canals, they store grain, they create bureaucracies. And then something sweeps over. Water, conquest, collapse. And the city becomes a mound, a tell, a layer of before buried under a layer of after. And then on the same spot, a new city is built, sometimes with the same name, sometimes with a new one, but always with the same gesture, rebuilding on top of ruin. Return after descent. Civilization as a cycle of settlement destruction, resumption. And if you scale up further, the king list makes the same move. Kingship descends. It is. Then the flood sweeps over. Then kingship descends again. Not because humans reinvented it, not because they discovered governance anew, but because the pattern of order reappears as if it were an object that can be withdrawn and returned. And if kingship can be taken up and lowered again, then the question becomes unavoidable. What else can be taken up? What else can be returned? What else follows the same architecture? That question is where the underworld texts start to stop feeling like stories. Because Kur is not described as metaphor. It is described as administered territory. It has gates. It has officials. It has judges. It has records. It has districts. It has rules that even gods must obey. And the descent to Kur is not described as vague fading away. It is described as structured passage. 7 gates, 7 thresholds, 7 removals. Not because 7 is pretty, because 7 is a complete system, a full sequence, a set of stages that must occur in order. And then again, the counted duration. 3 days, 3 nights, not some time, not a long time. 3, counted, measured. And then return becomes possible, but only if procedure is followed, only if rules are satisfied, only if balance is maintained. A substitute must be provided. A replacement must descend so the one who rose can walk above. And if you listen carefully, that is the same logic as the substitute king ritual. A death is required. A period is dangerous. A system expects a loss. So the priesthood provides a stand-in, a substitute who takes the blow, a wrong name in the right slot, a correct timing with an incorrect target, and the system accepts it. Not because it is compassionate, but because it is procedural, because it operates on rules, on categories, on roles, on designations. And suddenly the underworld is no longer only theology. It becomes a model for how systems behave when they are mechanical rather than moral. And that loops us to the Giddim again. Because the Giddim is not described as fiction. It is described as inevitable. Every person has one. It persists. It can be hungry. It can be angry. It can return if neglected. It can be summoned under controlled conditions. It can serve as witness in oaths. This is not the language of vague spirituality. It's the language of bureaucracy applied to the dead. And bureaucracy, by its nature, assumes systems, stable systems, repeatable systems. If a ghost can be summoned, then there must be a route. If a ghost can be blocked, then there must be a gate. If a ghost can be fed, then there must be a continuity of identity that can receive feeding. And if identity persists into Kur, then Kur is not merely the end. It is a location in a larger network. A node in a cycle, which returns us again to the uncomfortable synthesis. When you arrange these elements side by side, what you see is not a set of unrelated myths. You see a single structural claim repeating at multiple scales. The day descends into night and returns. The moon descends into darkness and returns. The year descends into drought and returns. Dumuzi descends into Kur and returns. Kingship descends from heaven, is withdrawn, and descends again. The dead descend into Kur, and at least in some cases, movement back upward is not unimaginable because the system contains roots, exceptions, and procedures. And the texts do not offer this as comfort. They do not say, "Don't worry, it's all fine." They also do not say, "This is evil, you must escape." They document, they map, they preserve, which is why for modern readers the tension becomes sharp. Because modern myth usually explains. It gives reasons, it moralizes, it ends. But this Mesopotamian material often refuses to do that. It describes mechanisms, it lists steps, it counts days, it assigns duties, and it circles back again and again to the same shape: descent, duration, return, repetition. And when you see it that way, the question changes. It stops being, "Is this true?" and becomes something slower, stranger. Why do these people keep describing existence as if it is engineered? Why do the rituals read like protocols? Why do the myths read like administrative case files? Why do the numbers remain so stable? Why does the same architecture appear in heaven on earth and below? And perhaps most importantly, why is there no final exit Gilgamesh cannot escape? Dumuzi cannot escape. Even Inanna cannot leave without paying the system's price. The substitute requirement is non-negotiable. The balance must be maintained, which implies that the cycle itself is not optional. It is not a choice. It is the operating condition. And that returns us again to the core dilemma. If these are merely stories, they are unusually procedural stories. If these are merely symbolic, they are unusually consistent symbols. If these are merely inventions, they are inventions that behave like documentation. And the Sumerians, so careful elsewhere, so precise elsewhere, treat them as information. As if their job was not to entertain, not even primarily to persuade, but to preserve a model. And if they preserved a model, then we should ask what people always ask when they find a model in an archive. What is it for? A model can be for teaching. A model can be for warning. A model can be for operating within a system. Or, more unsettling, a model can be for manipulating a system not through force, but through knowledge of how it works. The substitute king ritual already implies that. If the system can be redirected by correct procedure, then knowledge becomes leverage. Not divine leverage, not rebellion, leverage inside the rules. And the Underworld texts already imply that too. If the underworld has laws, then laws can sometimes be navigated. If the underworld has gates, then gates might be opened. If the underworld has officials, then officials can sometimes be engaged. Which brings us back to Enki, because Enki is the one who consistently behaves like someone who understands procedure better than others. He finds loopholes. He speaks to walls. He creates beings that bypass categories. He circumvents oaths without breaking them. He protects continuity when the majority wants erasure. And if there is any figure who represents system knowledge in this literature, it is him. So when we ask what the model is for the texts, quietly answer without declaring it. It is for survival, not survival as heroism. Survival as technical navigation. Survival as knowing how the gates work, how the cycles turn, how the reset happens, how the system balances itself, how to live inside a structure that is larger than any individual and that will continue regardless of your belief. And if that is the function, then the most dangerous question is not, is the cycle real? The most dangerous question is, if it is real, what can knowledge do inside it? Because that is where the myths stop being stories and begin to feel like manuals. And the next part moves directly into the heart of that, because once you accept that the Sumerians were obsessed with cycles, you start noticing a second obsession woven into the same clay. Not just cycles, intervention, ways to bend fate, ways to redirect outcomes, ways to exploit procedure, ways to survive what was decreed. And that takes us straight into the question they keep circling without ever answering cleanly. If the system is mechanical, can it be operated? If the previous part is the wheel descent duration return, then this part is the hand that reaches toward the axle, not to stop the wheel, not to break it, but to touch the mechanism, to find the place where the pattern can be redirected. Because the Mesopotamian record does not only describe cycles, it also describes procedures. And procedures imply something that simple myth does not always imply. They imply that the system can be engaged, not only observed, not only feared, engaged. The easiest way to see this is to start with a discomfort the tablets never fully soothe. If everything is cyclical, if descent and return are built in, if kingship descends and is withdrawn and descends again, if floods sweep over civilizations reset, life resumes diminished, then what is the role of choice? What is the role of action? What does a person do in a world where the deepest patterns do not ask permission? You could assume the answer is resignation. You could assume the answer is prayer. You could assume the answer is helplessness. But the tablets don't behave that way. They document people trying to do something more precise than praying. They document people trying to find the rules. And once you find rules, you start asking a different kind of question. If rules exist, can rules be used? Not to abolish fate, not to overthrow the gods, but to navigate the pathways the rules allow. That is why the substitute king ritual matters. It is not an incidental oddity. It is a direct claim embedded in practice that the cosmos responds to procedure. An omen appears. An outcome is predicted. And instead of simply accepting the outcome, the priesthood creates a bureaucratic workaround. A temporary king is installed. The real king becomes someone else. The predicted death is delivered, but delivered to the substitute. Then the system is considered satisfied, and the real king returns to his throne. This doesn't read like emotional religion. It reads like a legal maneuver, like a contract's loophole exploited by someone who knows contract language. like a system of enforcement that can be appeased by technical fulfillment rather than moral truth. And that implies something enormous. It implies that the machinery doesn't see in the way we imagine divine judgment seeing. It tracks roles, times, designations. It enforces outcomes according to categories. And categories can be manipulated. This does not require the cosmos to be stupid. It requires the cosmos to be structured. Structured enough that certain substitutions are acceptable within its own logic. And once you accept that, you begin noticing the same logic elsewhere. Enki's wall speech is the clearest example. The gods swear an oath. No one will warn humanity. The decision is locked. Procedure is secured. And yet Enki bypasses it. Not with open defiance, not with a fight, with a technicality. He doesn't speak to the man. He speaks to the wall. The wall is addressed. The man hears. And the oath, strictly interpreted, remains unbroken. That is exactly how systems are circumvented by people who understand systems. Not by rejecting the rules, by finding the gaps between rules and intent. Enki doesn't destroy the oath. He exploits its boundary conditions, and the result is survival inside an extinction policy. Again, not rebellion. Operation. Procedure used against procedure. The same logic appears in the Underworld material. Inanna cannot leave without a substitute. This is stated as absolute, non-negotiable. Even gods cannot ignore it. And yet the text immediately shows you that absolute does not mean simple, because the substitute can be chosen, and then the substitute can be shared, and then the substitute can be rotated. Half a year, a compromise, a schedule, a cycling solution to an inviolable rule, which tells you something important. Even when the rule cannot be broken, it can sometimes be managed. The system requires balance. Fine. Then balance will be maintained through rotation, through periodic exchange, through a calendar. This is not the language of a universe governed by unpredictable mood. It is the language of a universe governed by constraints that can be worked with. So then we return again to the question that keeps circling. If the wheel cannot be stopped, what can be changed inside the wheel? The Mesopotamians appear to answer timing, target, pathway, substitution, and knowledge, because knowledge is what makes all of this possible. You cannot install a substitute king without knowing what counts as substitution. You cannot exploit an oath without knowing how oaths bind. You cannot rotate a substitute in the underworld without understanding the underworld's enforcement logic. You cannot be procedural unless you believe the world responds to procedure. And that brings us to a category of text that makes modern readers especially uneasy. Not the myths, not the king list, not the laments, but the texts of averting, the ones that treat fate as readable and in some cases modifiable, the ones that assume a predicted outcome can be redirected if you intervene correctly before it manifests. This is where the idea of being trapped in a cycle becomes more complicated. Because the texts don't describe humans simply enduring, they describe humans attempting to operate, to negotiate, to redirect, to survive. Not by strength, but by knowing which lever to pull. And this is where the Sumerian obsession with catalogs, lists, and protocols stops being cultural flavor and becomes a clue. Because a culture that thinks in contracts will search for contractual structures in the cosmos. A culture that records grain receipts will record ritual steps. A culture that organizes labor will imagine divine administration. And if the cosmos is administered, then administration can sometimes be approached the way administration is approached, by petition. Yes. But also by compliance with procedure, by presenting the right form, by paying the right fee, by speaking the right words, by acting at the right hour. The underworld is the most literal expression of that. It has gatekeepers, it has judges, it has records, it has rules, which means, at least in principle, there are ways of moving within it if you know the protocols. So, when a tablet describes 7 gates, it is not only telling you there are 7 stages, it is telling you there are 7 checkpoints, 7 places where something is exchanged, 7 places where the process can be recognized as it occurs. And recognition matters because recognition implies orientation. And orientation implies the possibility of agency. Not agency to avoid death, but agency to navigate what death does. Now here is where the script must not rush, because the temptation is to leap forward into conclusions, to say, therefore reincarnation is real, or therefore the system is engineered, or therefore the myths are manuals. But the original tone refuses that. It circles, it returns, it asks again with slightly different phrasing, the same pressure point question. If the Sumerians were documenting patterns, were they also documenting methods? Not methods to escape, methods to endure, methods to redirect, methods to survive inside constraints. The flood narratives are full of this. The gods decide. One man is warned. A boat is built. Seed is preserved. The world is reset. And something continues. The key is not moral virtue. It is information. Someone knew. Someone acted. Someone built according to specification. And so, something survived. And the specification matters. Dimensions, pitching, compartments, what to bring, how to seal. The survival of life is framed not as miracle, but as engineering. And engineering again implies that the world responds to correct construction. That reality can be navigated through technique. And if that is true at the scale of flood, then the question becomes unavoidable at the scale of death. If there are 7 gates, is there a way to prepare? If there are 3 days, is there a window? If there is a substitute requirement, is substitution always enforced the same way? Or more unsettling, does the system contain loopholes the way oaths contain loopholes? This is not a new claim. It is exactly what the texts keep demonstrating. Rules exist. Rules are enforced. But within rules there are cracks. Enki's cracks. The priesthood's cracks. The underworld's negotiated compromises. And once you accept that, you begin seeing the same pattern in how the Mesopotamians approached time. They did not only tell stories about cycles, they tracked cycles, they calculated, they predicted, they wrote down when Venus would rise, they noted when an eclipse would occur. They built calendars that map celestial regularity into ritual scheduling, which suggests that the system is not just cyclical, but predictable. And predictability is the precondition for intervention. If the eclipse comes at a known time, you can prepare. If the dangerous omen appears, you can act. If the underworld takes 3 days, for a certain threshold, you can mark it. If Dumuzi returns on schedule, you can meet the return. The cycle does not make action meaningless. It makes action strategic. So the question shifts again. It stops being, is everything fated? and becomes, what kind of fate is it? A fate that is absolute and unmodifiable, or a fate that is structured with fixed constraints and flexible pathways. And the Mesopotamian record taken as a whole leans toward the second. Some things are fixed. You will die. You will descend. The underworld has law. But within that, certain outcomes can be shaped. Certain harms can be redirected. Certain decrees can be delayed. Certain disasters can be softened. Certain destinies can be loosened. And this brings us slowly, carefully to the next node in the archive, the concept of decree. The me, the tablet of destinies. The idea that authority, even divine authority, can be embodied in transferable instruments. Because if power is a thing that can be held, moved, stolen, returned, then the boundary between God and human becomes less clean than we want it to be. Not because humans become gods, but because systems that run on instruments can sometimes be operated by whoever has access to the instrument and knows the procedure. And that is precisely where the next part goes. Because once you notice intervention inside the wheel, you inevitably start asking, who controls the wheel's controls? Who holds the instruments of decree? Who has access to the levers? And why do so many Mesopotamian stories revolve around something being taken and not being taken back? Hold the question from the last part in your mind, not like a problem to solve quickly, but like a weight you keep returning to. If the wheel can be touched, if the pattern can be redirected inside its own constraints, then what matters most is not belief, but access. Access to the right objects, access to the right words, access to the right procedures, access to the right timing. And that is where Mesopotamian cosmology becomes quietly alarming. Because it does not describe divine power as an abstract glow that belongs naturally, eternally to divine beings. It describes divine power as something that can be handled, possessed, transferred, lost, stolen, recovered. And when power is structured that way, authority becomes less like an essence and more like an office, a role with tools, a title with instruments, a function that depends on what you hold. The word that keeps appearing again and again is me. Those divine decrees, those powers, those capacities that are simultaneously principles and possessions. Kingship is a me. Priesthood is a me. Judgment is a me. Writing is a me. Music is a me. Truth is a me. And the texts do not treat these as vague ideas floating in the air. They treat them as things that can be counted, cataloged, listed, moved, installed. And if they can be moved, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who has them now? And what happens when they change hands? The story of Inanna and Enki is the clearest demonstration. It is usually retold as comedy. A god gets drunk. A goddess charms him. He hands over the gifts. He regrets it later. It reads like mythic humor. But strip away the tone, and the structure becomes stark. A goddess wants the instruments of civilization. She goes to the place where they are stored. She gains access. She receives them. She transports them. And once they have been installed in her city, the transfer becomes effectively final. Enki's attempt to retrieve them fails, not because he is weak, but because the transaction is complete in procedural terms. The object has moved, the authority has moved with it. It is not simply that Inanna becomes powerful. It is that the mechanism that produces power has changed location. And that is the deep implication. Divine power is not only about who you are, it is about what you hold. This is not a minor theological nuance. It is a blueprint for how a system works. Because in a system like this, the most dangerous thing is not a rival god. It is a rival who acquires the right instruments. And once you realize that, you notice how often Mesopotamian myth is about theft, seizure, transfer. The tablet of destinies is the same logic expressed at the highest level. The object that authorizes fate. The instrument that makes decrees binding. When it is stolen, the gods panic. Because they are not merely facing an enemy with claws or teeth. They are facing an enemy with the controls. If you hold the instrument that determines destiny, then even gods must negotiate with the fact that destiny is now being authored elsewhere. In the Anzu myth, the theft is blunt. Anzu takes the tablet from Enlil. Suddenly, the cosmos is out of order. The gods cannot simply overpower him. Because the thing they need to command reality has moved. In Enuma Elish, the logic returns. Kingu is given the tablet. The other gods fear him. Marduk kills him and takes it. The cosmos is stabilized through retrieval. Again, the crisis is not only war. The crisis is possession. The mechanism has a location, and the location matters. Now return slowly to the priesthood and to the way those ritual texts read. If kingship is a me and kings on earth exercise it, then it follows that mortal rulers are operating with a distributed instrument of cosmic authority. Not metaphorically, functionally. If priesthood is a me and priests on earth perform it, then it follows that mortal specialists are operating with a distributed instrument of cosmic authority. If the Emi are transferable, if they can be stolen even among gods, then we have to ask the question that the texts themselves hover near, without stating plainly what prevents mortals who already possess some me by necessity of their roles from using them beyond the narrow scope intended. What prevents a human operator from taking a procedural system seriously enough to push its boundaries? And the answer within the Mesopotamian framework is not simple morality. It is not just the gods wouldn't allow it, because the gods themselves do not always allow things. And yet the transfer happens anyway. The answer is again the thing Mesopotamia is built on: procedure, knowledge, training, right words, right timing. Because an instrument you don't know how to operate is just an object. A crown is just metal. A tablet is just clay. A ritual is just sound. It becomes power only when you know what it does and how to activate it. That is why scribal culture matters. That is why texts are copied precisely. That is why dead languages persist in ritual contexts. Because the system is believed to respond to exact forms. If you change the form, you risk breaking the function. So the priesthood preserves forms like engineers preserve specifications. Not because it's pretty, because it's operational. And now the wheel turns again, back to a familiar point. If the myths are manuals, if the god's world is bureaucratic, if underworld gates have protocols, if oaths can be bypassed by technicality, if destiny is tied to an object, then the boundary between religion and technology, our boundary doesn't apply cleanly here. What looks like worship is often a kind of operation. What looks like story is often a kind of instruction. And this doesn't require us to decide yet whether the system is real. It requires us to acknowledge that the texts themselves treat it as real enough to be navigable. They write as if the cosmos is a system with levers. And if levers exist, you have to consider who is permitted to touch them. This is where the descent of Inanna shifts from being a dramatic myth to something closer to a schematic. Because what is Inanna doing? She is not inventing the underworld. She is entering an existing structure. She passes through gates. She surrenders items. She is judged. She is processed. She dies. She is revived. She returns with restored me. And she cannot return without providing a substitute. That structure, again, doesn't look like pure imagination. It looks like a rule set, a protocol, and the protocol is so stable that it can be reenacted annually, repeatedly, which means the text is not just telling you what happened to one goddess. It is telling you the steps, the stages, the constraints, which is exactly what you would preserve if you believed others needed to know how the system works. And once you accept that, you start reading the king list differently, too. Not as a fairy tale, but as a record of transfers. Kingship was in Eridu, then it was in Bad Tira, then it was in Larak, then in Sipar, then in Shurupak. Then the flood swept over. Then kingship was in Kish. Each line is an administrative relocation of authority, not invention, not emergence, relocation, which echoes the deeper cosmology authority descends, is installed, is moved, and the pattern continues. Now, return to Dumuzi. He dies. He descends. He returns. He descends again. Half year, half year. The system is maintained by rotation. Again, not freedom, but administration, which makes the question sharper. If existence is governed by administrative instruments, then the most powerful thing is not emotion. It's not even strength. It is competence. Competence at operating the system. Competence at reading the rules. Competence at knowing what can be transferred and what cannot. Competence at making the right exchange at the right gate. And that brings us back again to Enki. Because in the text you're working with, Enki is not just a god, he is a specialist, a technician of cosmic order, a manager of hidden structure, the one who knows how things operate beneath the surface, the one who understands the me, the one who understands oaths and loopholes, the one who can create beings that are invisible to the underworld's normal enforcement, the one who can transmit knowledge in ways that bypass restriction, which makes the next question unavoidable. If Enki understands the system that well, and if he distributes knowledge, then the real danger isn't that humans are weak. The danger is that humans once trained might become competent operators, not divine equals, but capable enough to exploit cracks, capable enough to survive against decrees, capable enough to change outcomes through technical alignment rather than petition. And this is exactly where the Sumerian and Akkadian record begins to feel less like religion and more like a long, slow argument about the politics of knowledge. Because once knowledge is given, it is hard to take back. Once a procedure is taught, it can be repeated. Once a text is copied, it can travel. Once the words exist in clay, they outlive the person who wrote them. And if that is true for grain receipts, it is also true for cosmic manuals. That is why the clay matters. It is why the scribes press the mark so carefully. Because clay makes knowledge durable. and durable knowledge makes authority vulnerable. A king can be replaced, a city can burn, a priest can die. But the instructions remain, and if the instructions remain, the system can be operated by someone new. Which is why in your script, the discomfort keeps returning like a pulse. Are these myths meant to inspire or to inform? Are they storytelling or documentation? Are they fantasy or manuals? And each time the question returns, it returns with more weight because the corpus keeps emphasizing instruments, transfers, procedures, mechanics. If the world is built on instruments, then the core struggle is always access, and access is always political, even among gods, especially among gods. So the line we keep circling toward without rushing becomes clearer. The Sumerians aren't only describing cycles, they are describing governance. A governed cosmos, with offices, with rules, with records, with controls that can be stolen, with systems that can be bypassed. And if that's true, then the next step is not to leap into grand conclusions. The next step is to follow the practical question the priesthood would ask. If the system has instruments, and some instruments are distributed, what exactly can a trained human do with them? Not hypothetically, not philosophically, procedurally, which is where the archive points next, not to more myth, but to the ritual texts that behave like technical manuals, the ones that tell you, do this at this hour, say this exactly, use these materials, follow this sequence, and the outcome will change. And the central question returns one more time harder now, because we've seen the structure that makes the question dangerous. If authority depends on instruments, and instruments can be handled, then what happens when a mortal learns to handle them so we arrive where the tablets keep pushing us? Not toward certainty, not toward a neat claim that settles everything, but toward the uncomfortable center of this entire archive. If the cosmos is procedural, then procedure is a form of power. Not power in the sense of muscles or armies, not power in the sense of moral right. Power in the colder sense, knowing what to do, knowing when to do it, knowing what can be moved, what can be substituted, what can be reversed, and what cannot. But because once you've followed the threads through Kingship that descends through floods, that sweep over through Dumuzi, who returns on schedule through a Giddim that persists as a witness, you start to see the same shape over and over a system. A wheel, a set of rules that does not stop to ask whether you agree. And at the center of that wheel sits one object in the cold dark of a museum vault, holding the bluntest version of the pattern in a form that refuses to become just a story. K162, 7 columns, wedge-shaped marks, a descent through 7 gates, a stripping, a judgment, 3 days and 3 nights, a return with conditions. And the more you sit with it, the more you notice what the text doesn't do. It doesn't plead. It doesn't sing, not primarily. It doesn't offer a moral that resolves the terror into a lesson. It describes a route, a protocol, a sequence you can't shortcut. And that is why the question keeps coming back, because the tablets themselves keep forcing it back into your hands. Are we reading mythology or instructions? And every time you try to step away from the question, the archive brings you back with another example. Kingship is not said to emerge. It descends. A flood is not said to happen. It sweeps over. Inanna does not lose her regalia. It is removed at each gate. Her minister does not panic. He follows the timeline. 3 days, then action. Enki does not break the underworld's law. He finds what the law does not forbid. He makes beings that the rules cannot see. He uses food and water of life as a tool with dosage. He restores the corpse. And still, even with all that, the substitute requirement stands. Even a workaround meets a boundary. Even knowledge meets a wall. Which is why the system feels so unsettlingly complete. Because it contains not only force, but constraints. Not only divinity, but a bureaucracy. Not only death, but administration. And if you've been listening carefully, you can feel the larger implication, forming slowly like dawn after a long ritual night. If the gods themselves are bound by oaths, and oaths can be bypassed by technicality, and instruments of power can be transferred, and the underworld enforces rules even on a goddess, then we are not in a cosmos of pure will. We are in a cosmos of structure, and structure can be learned. Structure can be mapped. Structure can be navigated. That's what the Sumerians did with the sky. They didn't need to know why Venus returns to predict that she will. They didn't need to know what gravity is to measure what repeats. They watched, they recorded, they treated pattern as something worth preserving. So when they turn that same attention toward death, toward descent, toward return, it is at least possible they are doing the same thing. Not inventing to soothe fear, but documenting what the system looks like from inside the system. And that brings us back to the tension the script keeps holding without resolving. On the one hand, these texts can be read as symbolic. 7 gates as stages of letting go. 3 days as a metaphor for transformation. The underworld as the psychological depth a person enters when identity collapses. Dumuzi as the seasonal rhythm of crops and rain. On the other hand, the texts themselves refuse to behave like purely symbolic literature. They behave like records. They love numbers. They love sequence. They love roles: gatekeeper, judge, minister, substitute. They love constraints, rules that even gods don't overrule. And they keep returning to the same pattern at every scale: daily descent into night and return at dawn. Monthly disappearance of the moon and reappearance. Annual death and return of a shepherd god. Civilizational resets by flood, followed by kingship, descending again. Individual death, the Giddim continuing the underworld structured access controlled, which is why the question at the heart of your documentary isn't really, is it true? That's the trap question, the one that tempts a single clean conclusion. The real question, over and over from different angles, is what kind of mind writes like this? What kind of culture treats afterlife? Geography, like an administrative district. What kind of scribal tradition describes divine power as transferable instruments? What kind of worldview assumes that once something is set in motion, it operates by rule, and that knowing the rule matters? And once you ask that, another question follows, quieter but heavier. If the rules can be known, then ignorance isn't merely unfortunate. It's dangerous, because ignorance means you enter the gates blind. Ignorance means you miss the window. Ignorance means you don't know what is being taken or why. Ignorance means you interpret a mechanism as a mood. And if the system is indifferent, then mistaking it for mood changes nothing. So, the scribes write. They copy, they preserve. Not because they can stop death, not because they can end cycles, but because they can reduce blindness. They can make the route legible. They can ensure that at least once someone has mapped the shape of what's coming. Which brings us to the most honest and most brutal detail the archive keeps implying. There is no rehearsal for the final descent. You can reenact Inanna annually. You can lament Dumuzi on schedule. You can update king lists. You can track eclipses. You can perform substitute rituals to deflect omen pressure. But you cannot step into your own death to check the instructions. And if the cycle is real, you cannot return with memory intact to report back. That is the sting. That is the lock. If the pattern is true, it's self-sealing. The only proof comes at the moment you cannot bring proof back. And the texts seem to know this. They circle the same themes because they are circling an unspeakable boundary. We can document the system's edges. We can record what the myths say happens. We can observe cycles in sky and season and civilization. But we cannot verify the central claim in the one way that would satisfy modern hunger for certainty. Because the test deletes the tester. And even that structure fits the Mesopotamian model, a system that runs whether you approve or not, a system that does not depend on belief to function, a system that is older than you, a system that outlasts you. So, what do we do with that? The tablets don't tell you what to feel. They don't tell you to panic. They don't tell you to hope. They do what Mesopotamian writing always does when it's being most honest. They record. They list. They preserve. They keep the pattern alive in clay, and in the end, the documentary returns to the only point where you still have something that resembles choice. Not the choice of whether the cycle exists, not the choice of whether the gates will take you, but the choice of what you do before the next gate, what you preserve, what you transmit. Because that is the one human power the tablets demonstrate across millennia. Knowledge can outlast catastrophe. Even when language dies, even when cities burn, even when everyone who understood the system is gone. Clay waits, script waits, a pattern waits, and eventually someone reads again. So we end where we began, in the cold of the vault. K162, sitting in darkness, 7 gates, 3 days, a return that costs someone else, a cycle that doesn't ask permission, and the question that refuses to be solved, only revisited. Were they documenting a system or inventing a story? If they were inventing, then the tablet is a human artifact of fear and imagination. If they were documenting, then the tablet is something else entirely, a manual left in the dark for whoever comes next. And if the cycle is real, then whoever comes next might be you, not as you are now, not with your memory intact, but as the same essence, moving through the same architecture. Again, believing it's the first time, because that is how the system keeps itself stable. So, just once, quietly, place your marker, if you want. Not a speech, not a performance, just a location and an hour. Because if the wheel is real, then this moment is a coordinate on it. And whether the Sumerians were wrong or right, they did one thing with absolute clarity. They tried to preserve what they saw. They pressed it into clay. They trusted the pattern enough to write it down. And then they disappeared into their own darkness, leaving the manual behind.